Today's podcast is brought to you by Progresso Talent Partners, who for more than 25 years have successfully delivered interim and permanent leadership talent to transform businesses. To hire the talent you need to enable your business to thrive, visit www.progressotalent.com today. Colin, welcome back. Listeners, brief break to restock, replenish, because there was so much we got through in that first half, and there's so much more I want to get through now. And I want to start with this, of what I have great admiration for your courage in the vulnerability you've evidenced in sharing your journey. But I've also great admiration for anyone who can write a book. I'm a voracious reader. There's part of me that somewhat naively believes there's a book in there somewhere. I'm not quite sure as to what it might be, but there's it's probably conceit or arrogance, actually, the truth be known. But there's something in there that says there's a book. So anyone that's gone and put pen to paper, I have huge admiration for. You've written this wonderful, wonderful story. Man versus Food, the true story of an everyday guy on a dark journey into and back from the depths of a crippling addiction to anorexia nervosa. And you refer to the fallible man.
That's
me. Which I think is, it's in all of us, right? But I'm really intrigued to understand first and foremost what initially inspired you to write a book.
Well, my initial idea was to just get into blogging. I'm not a writer. So I was diagnosed with dyslexia last year. So actually, it's been quite short. I've never enjoyed reading. Never been able to read loads of books. But my journey towards recovery really only started once I started writing. So I'd spent between 2015, when I was first diagnosed, and 2019, 2020, I led 5 years of pretty much a lie. I was working. I did have a bad experience with one job which didn't last very long, and then spent 5 months trying to look for something. But I was living a lie. I was living a lie to myself, living a lie to my family, wife and kids. I was a full-blown, anorexic who, whilst I knew I had the condition, I neither knew how to or I simply didn't want to actually address the challenge that comes with actually turning things around.
So how was that lie playing out? Were you continuing the same behaviours that you continued before? So running
not
as
to
much,
the same extent,
not eating enough. That sort of pattern was still prevalent.
Oh, massively, yeah, yeah. And there were times when it did get a bit better, but when COVID hit, it definitely got worse.
Right.
So I was out running again when COVID hit. Same, old patterns started to emerge again. Out running every day. One of the interesting things actually is, and I talk about it in the book, the hybrid working environment that we're in now, and in some industries still fully remote. It's a perfect breeding ground for addiction, because it's all about secrecy and lies. And where you've got people working at home all the time, if there is that propensity to go down that type of path, how does the employer know? So when it came to the pandemic, don't get me wrong, I was working my absolute what's off, but that gave me the opportunity just to stick my trainers on at 2:00 and go out and do a half marathon. No one knew, even though I was working till 10 o'clock at night or whatever, it was no one knew.
And could you see that at the time? Did you know what you consciously knew what you were doing?
Oh yeah. No, and once it connects within, it is. I describe it as it's another voice.
And does that voice? How does that voice feel? By what emotions does that voice elicit? I'm wondering that, for example, do you as you're lacing up your runners, is there that guilt that comes with, I know what I'm doing, I'm going to do it anyway, but I know what I'm doing? Or does it not is it more of a lure and a pull that says, oh, great, you get to go running? This is...
Yeah, it's a massively persuasive force. But when you are running, it would say, oh, why don't we do this detour like we, for old time's sake, just so you get an extra couple of miles. But it's also, the way it is, the way it manifests or work with me, it's a bully within.
Right.
If you step out, if you step out of line with what I call in the book as either the primary or the secondary musts, these are the guiding rules that the way I describe it that underpin addiction. So, in my case, the primary must are all around how often I exercise and how long would I exercise for. Yeah. And I distinguish between primary and secondary because they are effectively, primary will cause the greatest amount of physical and mental harm. The secondary are byproducts, but still are equally as damaging. The anorexia is not just about starvation. It's around control in far broader aspects of that, including what time you can eat. When I was deeply ill, if I ate my breakfast before 11 o'clock, I go into a mental breakdown. Right? It's not just about the eating. It's this whole rigor that sits around the illness itself. It controls. You're living in a deep, dark world of constriction and controls. It's not just around the food.
I find that in itself fascinating.
So I've gone off on a tangent.
No, it's not. It's really informative and really enlightening. It informs much of my misunderstanding around how some of these issues impart, how you experience them. So it's really it's incredibly compelling, Colin, and great for you. Great that you should choose to share it with us, because I think there's a lot from which people can learn. So let's come back to the book, the writing journey.
Yeah. Yep.
You suggested perhaps blogging. You felt that. I'd imagine you've got this sense building up in you that you want to get this out. You want to, at some point, you've got to articulate this in some way, whether it's through whatever means be available to you. But you arrive at this conclusion, perhaps, that writing is the way you want to start to share the story.
Yeah. So when I did a couple of blogs, and it was they were okay, but I just felt like there was something bigger that I wanted. As you say, kind of wanted to get out of my system. Part of it, in fact, the primary reason why I've written the book is to help me, because I didn't actually understand it myself. I had a conceptual view of the journey that I'd led in life that had led to it, but I wanted to try and, even just in my own mind, just try and unpack things in terms of why this would happen to someone, not just myself, but anyone else, to try and explain how the illness works in very layman's terms, because it's really complex. I wanted to use it to vent some frustration. So the only negative feedback I've had from the book has been from my mum, who said I didn't bring you up to use language like that. And even though there aren't swear words, they are dotted out there. We're of a certain age group and working class background and all that. But I also wanted to use it because I'd got to this crossroads whereby I think I'd finally admitted to myself that unless I did something different, I wasn't actually going to get any better. And whilst I still class myself as an anorexic today, I'm a far more healthier one than I was when I first started to write the book. So, going back to some of the stuff we talked about in the past in terms of the way the NHS and the private sector actually look at eating disorders, I wanted to think about a different approach. So there isn't this case of whereby you have to stop everything. Abstinence is the only way to actually recover from an eating disorder. Because for me it didn't work, and I know for thousands of others it doesn't work, because that's why it's often an illness that lasts with people for decades sometimes. So I am by no means, I'm not medically trained in any way, shape or form. I'm only trained through experience. So the book was my opportunity to, I guess, leverage some of the thinking that I'd taken and experience from my professional life into trying to help me get to a better place in my personal life. And that was when I started to form a plan, my own kind of recovery plan around utilising the concept of marginal incremental gains. So marginal gains theory is something that was, I guess, made famous more with the British cycling team and Dave Brailsford, etc., etc. And I've always, or ever since I'd read that story in depth initially, probably, that was, decade ago now. However, it's something I've used quite a lot in my professional life in terms of driving transformational change, whereby you are constantly looking at, the small things, constant evolution of incremental improvements to drive something bigger, but it has to be a constant, as I say, a constant level of small gains. For me, taking that principle in terms of addiction recovery was my way of getting it onto a piece of paper and a nice structured program, which I then used myself to challenge myself on a daily basis, but in really small parts, because I knew that there wasn't a magical pill that was going to suddenly make me better.
Yeah.
And I knew that I wasn't capable, like any other addict, of just, particularly with an illness where you actually do need to do more to get better. I couldn't go from 0 to eating 4,000 calories a day, so I needed to try and find a way. Whilst I'm not eating 4,000 calories a day, I needed to try and find a way where I wasn't going to be lifting the bar massively in one go, where I can take small steps along a journey. So, yeah, that was the purpose. It was also my opportunity, and it did come later in the book, for me to have a good old-fashioned rant around elements of the world that we live in today that I do think is partly the reason why there's a growing group of more vulnerable people in society. That whilst mental illness and mental ill health, I think, is talked about a lot because it's a topical subject, I do actually think that the state of our nation, or particularly Western society, mental health is a lot worse than probably where it was 20 years ago.
Why do you think that is? And I should preface this by saying I've wrestled with this thought a lot. Not specifically why, but the thought that, so big plus, we talk about it a lot more. There's
massive
far
plus.
greater awareness than ever there was. We've got a long way to go, but it's a subject that gets talked about. So I couldn't quite decide, is there more, and I have no research to evidence this, it's my thought process, but is there more mental illness, or is it that we're just better at talking about it and we've become more aware of it? And I don't know the answer to that, but it is a thought that's occupied my mind. So to your point around your sense that there is perhaps a greater number of cases, a greater prevalence of challenges around our mental health. Why do you think that is? What's your thought?
I think, a lot of people, the first go-to is the pandemic, right? Where it's generally where most things go. It's not my first go-to.
No, my sense is that's, for want of a better expression, convenient place to start, because it seems like a logical place to start. But it doesn't, I don't get the sense that this is something that just sort of happened post 2021, 22. I feel this has been around for the last 10 years at least. It feels like in my mind, that might be because I had my own challenges, significant challenges around mental health 10, 15 years ago. So it might be that that's some kind of, bias from my perspective that's hardwired in. But it feels like it's been around a lot longer, and actually the pandemic, it's easy to go back and blame it all on the pandemic. I'm not suggesting that didn't have a significant impact. I'm sure it did. In fact, I'm utterly convinced it did, but it was around before.
I would say that, there are two, for me, I've got, in the book I talk about six different kind of key parts of life that I think are having or have had a big impact. But if I pick on two of them, I think the pandemic definitely did have an impact when it comes to one of them in particular. I do think that's social media. I would say that the pandemic gave a huge boost in terms of our relationship with the digital world.
Yeah.
Because the way we were living at that point in time was obviously ripped up overnight. I think the digital world for me, particularly social media, has done two things. I think it's driving huge divides across society. We have, and that's largely, there is a lot of polarised thinking out there at the moment, which really worries me, which is largely driven by the algorithms, those wonderful sophisticated algorithms within the platforms that do nothing more than provide people with confirmation bias.
Absolutely.
Information out there, you don't know whether it's real, whether it's not, and it's really divisive. A lot of it's really, really divisive, and it really worries me. It genuinely concerns me, and it concerns me for the state of my kids and all the other kids.
What I think I would add to that is that once upon a time there were trusted institutions from a reporting perspective.
Yep.
So I look at, for example, growing up, rightly or wrongly, but if there was a major world event, you'd put the BBC News on because you would trust what the BBC was sharing with you would be unbiased, responsible, logical reporting.
Correct.
Unfiltered, but nonetheless unbiased reporting. I don't know that's true, but that was my feeling around. That's what the BBC represented as a brand. And this isn't me doing down the BBC, but what I am going to talk about is that traditional media, instead of going, oh, you know what, just because you heard it on Facebook doesn't make it true, seems to have gone down the route of, oh God, we can't beat them, we'll join them. So actually what we'll go for is the clickbait, the headline grab, the sensationalism. So if you want to believe something now, you can find infinite places on the internet that will confirm your view.
Absolutely.
And would lead you to conclude as you dive into the comments that there's a gazillion other people out there that feel the same way.
Absolutely.
So it must be true. And yet, I heard something interesting debate this morning, just driving over here, around the use of social media with kids. And actually this sense that what the social media companies need to do is they need to have a genuine age verification methodology. The reason that was given as to why they won't do it is because their user numbers will drop considerably because there's an awful lot of kids that have accounts that shouldn't have accounts. There's an awful lot of bots which are driving a lot of that information feed, that if you then had to have some kind of verification method to become a subscriber, they'd lose a whole bunch of those bots that would then lead the prospective investors, stakeholders, whatever, to conclude, your numbers are dropping, so therefore
follow the
money, right?
Yep.
So there's all these, conspiracies I could wrap around it unhelpfully perhaps, but I do think that is a real challenge that, you can find multitude of ways these days to confirm your perspective.
Oh yeah, and it can be fundamentally wrong. And actually it's become increasingly difficult, I think, over the last few years. What is the truth?
One of the most liberating things I've done of late, which may not sound hugely revolutionary, but it has literally been, it's been liberating, is I switched off all the notifications on my phone. So the only thing I've got now, so nearest and dearest can contact me anytime. So I've got the access so that, my kids, whatever, need to your parents.
Yeah.
If they need to reach me, they can reach me. Everything else is off. So then I will consciously check my email, but my email doesn't check me. I will consciously check messages, but my messages don't check me. So the downside is, what I've noticed is I have to retune my behaviour, because I have noticed that sometimes people will nudge me, oh, you haven't responded to my email, 5 minutes after they've sent it. Yeah. Not untypical, but there is that we live in back to what we said earlier, that always on world where the responsiveness element is, I've sent something, so I've been able to articulate that out there now. I'm expecting you to do this, to be the same courtesy and respond. I understand why that happens, but if we work in the same office, you walk into you walk to my desk and I'm sat with someone having a conversation, the likelihood is, unless it's desperately urgent, you'll turn around and go, I'll go back to Lee in a minute, he's busy.
Yeah.
But when we don't see someone, we don't have that. So the thing for me has been switching off all notifications, and the impact that it's had on me,
I wish my kids would do that.
It's been dramatic.
Because I'll tell you, the amount of nervous energy that particularly in children.
Well, do you know in the US now, so average US teenager, how many hours a day would you hazard a guess spends on social media?
I can tell you how many my son does, because he told me yesterday and I wasn't happy.
It's 5 hours a day in America.
Oh, right, okay, yeah. Yeah. So my son, it was an interesting conversation, because he came up to me the other day. He said, "Oh, Dad, I was on Snapchat for 22 hours last week." And I looked at him and I thought, right, how do I respond to that? Because he was genuinely proud of himself. He's 13. He's no, and the problem is,
there's no difference to anyone else.
He's no different to anyone else.
It's not unique. Yeah, I agree.
And we constantly, as parents, we're constantly treading the fine line.
Do you know one of the things that Snapchat does around this? So they have I can't think what they would call it. You have not a trend. I can't think of the word. It's completely escapes me. This is now really bad. But what they will do is, so your son will get a notification that will say something like, "Oh, you've had some interaction with Fred 4 days in a row.
4 days in a row.
Don't miss today, because otherwise you'll lose your thread, or whatever they're calling it. You lose your I'll think of the word at some godly time of the night, but you'll lose that trend. So don't forget to send in something today.
You start back to zero. Yeah, so
you go back to zero if that's the case, and you want to keep that trend up.
Exactly.
So you're on a streak. That's what they call it. You're on a streak. You're on a 4-day streak with Fred. You want to keep that streak going. Keep going. So they nudge you.
Yeah.
So they're feeding that little dopamine hit every time, and it's dangerous.
Well, it is dangerous. It is so dangerous for kids, because as I say, we're constantly treading this fine line in terms of taking an authoritative stance with the kids and actually allowing them to have a bit of freedom at the same time. But you can see that, if a notification comes up on either of their phones, you might be mid-flow in a conversation, you kind of, dad's out the window, the phone's gone off, sort of thing. I've got to get to the phone. That's far more important than.
But it's interesting. I noticed this, and my mother won't be listening to this, so I'm not going to do the disservice of humiliating in front of my audience now. But as an example, so possibly this is a different generational thing. So, we would have grown up in a time where there were fixed line telephones at home, right?
Yes.
And you'd get that kind of, if you're on the phone to your girlfriend for too long, you get a disapproving look, unless it was after 6 o'clock when calls were cheaper. Yep. People won't understand what that means, many listening to this today.
No, they won't.
So if I'm having a conversation with my mum face to face and her phone rings, she will answer the phone, always, without a moment's hesitation. No, excuse me a minute. She'll just look at it and she'll go, "Oh, hang on." She'll answer the phone. And I've said to her on so many occasions, "Mum, you can see who that is that's ringing."
Yeah,
right?
Which you couldn't before.
You couldn't once upon a time, but
no.
Her hardwiring, her phone rings, you'd go and answer the phone, because if it would ring off, you wouldn't know until they introduced that wonderful 1471 or whatever it was.
Yeah.
You didn't know who'd called you. Yeah. You'd be forever thinking, was that important? Who could it have been?
Yeah.
So, but now you've got caller ID. It's very easy. But my mum, she's in her 70s. We would be mid-conversation. It might be the deepest of conversations.
Right.
She will still go, "Oh, excuse me a minute." And she'll answer the phone. I'm sort of sat here going, it's a generational thing. It's a kid. No, I see it from all walks of life and doing these things. But I mean, I don't want to make this all about being up on social media, but I'm really intrigued actually as to your journey, coming back to the book.
Yeah.
How do you think it's the experience of writing it? How has it impacted you? How has it changed you?
That's a really interesting question. I think it's the biggest thing that's probably changed is my acceptance that it happened, if that makes sense. And it's still happening. The other element of acceptance is that I accept that this challenge the underlying challenges that sit with the addictive connection, they're never going to leave me. And to finally accept that as actually being quite, to a certain extent, quite liberating. But when you're living, so many years where I was living in, kind of a state of, I was malnourished, really, really unwell. I kind of didn't want to accept what I was actually going through. So I've come out of the other side of writing the book, and I can kind of recognise I've got something there that documents kind of what's happened. So to a certain extent, it's kind of closed a bit of a chapter on my life. I've got no doubt, going back to the point that things you don't just suddenly get better and then you move on. There'll probably be further chapters, but hopefully there'll be better chapters than some of the ones that are in the book.
I think
in terms of the subject matter, that is.
Yeah, I think it says a lot about the book itself. It's a tremendous insight into a number of resilience for one, I think is the thing. Let me take that back a stage. First things first, it's incredibly courageous. The second thing that strikes me is you utterly own it. So you're not looking to apportion blame.
No.
You're not looking, you're saying, this is me, this is what, this is what I have, and this is what I'm doing about it, and this is my story. And there's a real ownership to it, which I think is incredibly courageous. It evidences, tremendous resilience, because it is, as we were talking off camera, resilience, that is one thing that concerns me about the world in which we find ourselves, as to how resilient people are. And the message I think that many can take from this is that we all have our challenges. We all have things that we face, and we have a choice as to how we embrace them. We can try and overcome them. We could try and meet them headlong. We can try and battle them. We can try and get over them and move on from them and learn from them. Or we can just, we could just accept it and take it for what it is and never do anything about it and suffer as a consequence. Now, both involve suffering and hardship. But actually, one invokes, a true message of hope and possibility and what can be. And I love that sense of endless possibilities. I think the world is full of them. And one is fraught with all sorts of misery. And I think, it's a wonderful message that you share.
Yeah, for me, I'm pleased I'm through, as I say, I'm through to the other side of the turmoil, 100%. And writing has gave me that final, I guess, boost to push me through to the other side. And I would say to anyone that's facing long-standing challenges in life, you don't have to write a book. The book doesn't have to be published. I mean, I've just done this myself. I've done this completely on my own, literally on my own. All the editing, everything went on Amazon, etc. I haven't used a publisher at all, and I didn't write it to sell copies. If that sounds like a really weird thing to do, but
I think that's the sense you get from it, is that you wrote it as part of your journey, as part of your recovery.
Yeah, and I'd say to anyone that's looking to maybe understand themselves more, the best way of understanding you more is just get all that crap that's in your brain and get it down on a piece of paper.
Yeah, I think you find whatever
you do start to make sense of it.
You find whatever works for you. I think the difference here is that I've understood. I journal. I have done for years, for the longest time, because I love to write.
Yeah.
But I don't publish that to the world. In fact, I had an experience once where I left my journal on a train, and I was utterly horrified. The panic that set in is years ago now.
Did you get it
back?
The
panic, no, never seen it again. The panic that set in when I realised I'd left that notebook on a train and what was in it. Some of the darkest times in my life were in that journal.
Right.
But what I do know is I found it incredibly cathartic, and I still do it to this day. Yeah. But I think, this point, this is where my point around ownership comes in. You've published this to the world. I think that's incredibly brave. And it's very raw, it's very real, it's very relatable. And I think it says to people, back to what I said earlier, we all have our challenges. They are different to different people. There's not it's not a better or worse. We've all got them. They're all relative to you at that moment in time, and how you choose to deal with it is uniquely personal.
Yep.
And so I'm not, as you're not, saying, well, write a book and all your problems will be solved. But I do think the message around, find a way, and you will find a way, is a really, really positive message to impart. What about let's talk about a bit about the role of the workplace in mental health and well-being, because I think this is one of the things you mentioned you're keen to perhaps to discuss. Do you think the sort of common proliferation of well-being initiatives and steps that are all done with the very best of intentions, I'm sure, all very well-meaning, but are organisations doing enough, do you think, to provide support around, this isn't any one specific organisation, just as a general observation, are organisations doing enough? Should organisations do more to support the mental well-being of their employees?
Quick answer, yes. And I don't answer that question in the sense of supporting people that suffer with mental illness at all. I think all too many organisations, particularly in the corporate sector, which is where I work, will invest a lot in terms of advertising their or if it's not advertising, it's virtue signaling or signaling their virtue. I see a lot on social media around, their investment in terms of the importance of their people and an organisation's kind of well-being. But actually, when you do scratch underneath the surface of how things work on a day-to-day basis in some of those organisations, I would say it shows that they don't necessarily care. When I say care, I mean genuinely care, right from the top. Genuinely care about how employees are feeling on a day-to-day basis, and it concerns me. It concerns me. The thing that really does concern me more than anything, I think, in terms of well-being, more recently and more so since the pandemic, is particularly for leaders and leaders of all levels. So junior management all the way up to kind of very 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 senior exec members. The expectation from many businesses now in terms of the capability of a leader on a day-to-day basis has expanded beyond all belief. And I think particularly since the pandemic, the way I describe it in the book is that there is this kind of innate expectation now that leaders need to be pseudo-psychologists, because the complexity of some of the situations that they are having to deal with in terms of people management, particularly if you've got a leader who actually carries a level of empathy and compassion, someone who wants to help their staff, the complexity of some of the situations they're actually dealing with are really, really tough. And organisations still kind of haven't, I don't think, really cottoned on to the fact that when it comes to recruiting people into leadership roles, and again, at whatever level that may be, taking or paying greater attention to the level of soft skills, how much, the level of empathy that someone shows and their ability to manage people, rather than, and it's particularly prevalent in my area of discipline, which is finance, rather than the technical capability of that individual.
What would you do? What advice might you give aspiring organisations who are trying to unlock that leadership capability and talent? What should they be doing, do you think?
For me, it sits at the top, right? It's authentic leadership. It's bringing people in that, are able to, who feel comfortable showing a degree of vulnerability. When I say vulnerability, I don't mean mental illness. I mean any form of vulnerability. I'd say it's having leaders who lead by example. They can get stuck in, So what I do. Well, my team may disagree with me here, but I'm happy to get stuck in the trenches with my team. Yeah, more than happy, because I know by doing that you're more likely to encourage people to follow you. Yeah, by building a culture within an organisation that is genuinely collaborative, not one where we can put it on a slide that says we're now going to be a collaborative organisation. Right, but actually those behaviours coming through from the top, people on the ground can see an exec team or see a mid-level management team, working together, without the politics, without the power struggles that are visible to all. That's when you're going to start seeing things change, because those will just run straight through the organisations, all the way from the top straight down.
Do you think there's I'm struck as we're having this conversation here that the focus around, let's call it coaching, right? Let's budget it as coaching. So is there a risk, do you think, that organisations go, right, so we've appointed you into a leadership position, let's say particularly from an external hire.
Yep.
So you've got this position because we recognise your capability and expertise. Mm-hmm. But there's a risk then. So where does the development then kick in? So where does that acknowledgement that lifelong learning is an important message to impart, and actually, just because you're in a C-suite role, just because the perception here is that, my concern is that you assume that leadership responsibility, and the organisation goes, but you're a leader, you know what to do, crack on. Yep. So the development stops. So at what point do you have does an organisation embrace maybe a chief coaching officer, whatever that person may be, but there's someone that sits on the board whose job it is to unlock that capability and develop that capability and leadership expertise in it. So it's not the CEO's job. Yep. There is actually someone on the board specifically with that responsibility, and everybody on the board is involved in it. The CEO, the chair, everybody's getting some of that, so that there's that sense, and it isn't about politics. Yep. Maybe you have a psychologist on the board who unlocks that
for me,
kind of.
I doubt that would ever happen.
No,
but that'd be brilliant.
It would be. It would work. It would be almost. I'm struck. I don't know if you watched Billions.
No, I have. But it's just
like a Wendy Rhodes on every board would be wonderful. She would, if you took about the crooked behaviour, but that would be a wonderful thing to impart.
I think, particularly in more complex organisations, where organisations, where they're complex in terms of, I don't know, the nature of the business they're doing, or how the business is actually set up structurally. I'd never really actually stumbled across the concept of a coach sat on
because business will buy it in, but it's reactive, isn't it? So they'll kind of go, we need more of this. Yeah, who can provide us with that? Coaching course, right? Off you go, guys. There you go. We've got this course. They'll do that. Yep. But if you have someone locked in full time, it's all about developing people at the very highest level and unlocking real leadership capability and expertise and understanding of others within your team. Yep. That might be really powerful.
That would be groundbreaking, but you're probably more likely to see that in a fast-growing SME than a large corporate. Because ultimately, as I say, it sits right at the top. It's long-term thinking, from my perspective, where CEOs would hugely benefit from the concept that actually cultural change, which takes time. And that's the thing. We're in a world where everything has to be done yesterday. True cultural change, which it takes years to deliver. Ultimately, in terms of shareholder value, that reaps rewards in multiples beyond that kind of traditional management approach. I don't think there's any. If you've got employees that are happy, they are productive, they will be committed to the organisation for longer. So therefore, you're retaining that expertise.
I think part of the challenge.
We just don't live in that world.
We don't, and I think I know as to the reason why. This is a really crude assessment, but if you look at the implications of quarterly reporting as an example, so
I know that all too well.
Absolutely. So if you are a CEO, you don't have time. Now, we all talk about the concept of a 5-year plan. I remember you would have done too. When I first started in my work, there was a 10-year plan in my first. I don't know that they exist anymore. Arguably, there aren't that many 5-year plans anymore. About 3 years, maybe. Yeah. There might be a 3-year plan. There's a 5-year plan in a drawer somewhere, but there's a 3-year plan. And so we have this concept of quarterly reporting. So that elicits behaviour that says, what is it that you're doing today to affect today's outcome? Mm-hmm. So I've got visibility. I've got 3 months out. I want to hit that number. Yep. So everything is geared towards that number. And then the next 3 months will be geared to the next 3 months number. Yep. Now, the argument would be that all feeds into the 3-year overall objective. I get that. Mm-hmm. But that's not the behaviour. The behaviour is not the 3-year. The behaviour is now. So I haven't got time for you to wait to develop your true leadership, softer skills, capability, Colin. That's wonderful. Your retention over the next 3 to 5 years is going to be impacted greatly. Well done, you. I haven't got time. I might not, because if I don't hit these metrics, I might not be here in 3 years' time. Exactly. So I really don't care. So there's not that alignment around shareholder value, and ultimately, I hate the phrase, and I nearly used it. I hate the phrase human capital, but ultimately, there's not that alignment between shareholder value and the human. That's a very broad generalisation. We could find organisations that would blow that out of the water, but I think that's part of the challenge, possibly.
But I don't disagree with you. I think part of it is down to largely the institutional investors, particularly in large corporates. They want quick results. So businesses end up, to be frank, and without getting political, using your words, businesses are being managed like the government. You're in 5-year cycles.
Do you know, it's interesting. I've got a really good friend of mine, and he's got an interesting perspective. So he was doing business, SME, but they were doing business in China and the US. Mm-hmm. So he's constantly looking east and west. So I had a conversation over far too many glasses of wine, the concept we came up with evidence of the fact that there were far too many glasses of wine. But nonetheless, I said to him, what's the difference from your experience? What's the difference? And he said, well, in my experience, so the US is thinking in terms of quarters.
Yep.
And the Chinese are thinking in terms of dynasties. So the US are thinking about what does this look like for our shareholders today? And the Chinese are thinking about what does this look like for our grandkids?
Yep.
Now, he said, I'm not saying one's right or wrong, and I'm not saying some of the practices I see in China don't deserve to be thoroughly, robustly tested.
Yes.
But they are thinking this is a 20, 30 year investment, not not even a 20, 30 week investment, a 20, 30 year investment. So I think we've got this interesting challenge right now where we see this conflict between East and West, not only politically, geopolitically, but also in terms of cultures and values. They're being, we're constantly, especially where we sit literally quite in the middle, we're constantly looking each way and thinking, well, which one works? Which way do we go?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it is somewhere in the middle. But as I say, particularly in the large corporate space, for me, that we're in crying. We need businesses to start really taking, seriously the importance and the returns that are actually delivered by a happy, healthy, motivated workforce. So turning on its head from where I think it currently stands today, and it's not the case in all large corporates. This is not, and there are pockets of absolute brilliance, but turning it on its head where there is this, I think, an unintentional. Well, it's not intentional. It's an unintentional perception that people are like collateral damage, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
if they resign, it's fine. We'll get someone else. So yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic. All I can do within my role, and I'm not perfect. I say this all along. No one's perfect. I make mistakes as a leader. I make mistakes every day. Okay, the key thing is that when I make those mistakes, I learn from them. I'm fallible, just like everyone else. So from my perspective, all I can do is what's within my control, within the business that I work in, working with my ex-com peers who are, really good bunch of people, working with a good CEO. All I can control is what's in front of me. And I can observe from, the broader world. But I just do think that there is, as I say, some elements of the corporate sector, and I think particularly financial services, they're really missing a trick in terms of toxic business culture and the impact that has on their people.
Let's end this on a positive note, because I think there's so much positivity
Just
around.
Don't mention the Chelsea score yesterday.
We won't mention Chelsea. I think there's so much positivity around the message you share. And I guess for anyone out there that's listening that is facing a struggle, something that they're wrestling with right now, that they're feeling that sense of, I don't know, maybe even despair is too strong a word. Even if you're just at a point at which you're thinking, I'm starting to become aware that I'm wrestling something here that I don't know how to overcome. Mm-hmm. What advice would you give them? What would you share? What messages of hope or support or direction, or however you want to describe it? What would you want to say to those people today that would give them some sense that there is a brighter future ahead?
I would say that if someone is starting to stumble across that concept within their own mind, that maybe there's something not quite working for them in their life, and you got to talk to someone. Right, it's the biggest mistake I made. Right, I didn't actually talk to anyone. Typical male response, and it is a stereotypical male response, and particularly, of a generation, growing up in the 80s and 90s, you kind of born and bred to be tough and nothing affects you.
The phrase "man up," right?
Yeah, exactly.
Persists.
Exactly.
Just man up.
So finding someone who you can confide in, and be open to the concept of actually saying, I'm really not coping at the moment. That for me is absolutely fundamental, and not seeing that as a sign of, by any means, a sign of weakness. The other one would be, and this is a really hard one to sell in terms of a concept. I'm a firm believer that in times of challenge in life, the best way to meet a challenge is to actually throw yourself into that challenge. and I know that doesn't work for everyone, or throw yourself into another challenge, another challenging situation. So, you know, when we talked about, so I referee, games of grassroots youth football. I do that twofold. Well, the reason why I did it twofold, one, because I'm a firm believer that sport is a great distraction away from technology. Obviously, I coach my son's side. But two, I did it because what's the response I get every time I say to someone that I referee games of football? It's always, why the hell would you want to do that? And the reason why I do that is because I know I'm going to be going into an uncomfortable situation. Some situations are probably more uncomfortable than should actually be tolerated. But by pushing yourself into, I guess, uneasy territory, that in itself, I think, helps to build resilience and to know that actually you can overcome challenges. You know, so you've got that evidence that you can do it. So those would be my couple of main pieces of advice. And the other ones, podcasts. Podcasts are brilliant. You know, you come across podcasts like this and other ones. There's fantastic stuff out there, some really good material, and you know, talking about mental health, mental resilience, etc. There's so much out there where you can listen to some very kind of genuine people that have been through experiences, and just that in itself enables you to connect with someone, although not physically, you know, in terms of seeing them in person, but someone who's going through something or has gone through something similar to you. Just knowing you're not alone.
Yeah. That's a really important message.
Difference.
Yeah.
Absolute huge difference.
Because it can feel lonely, right? That sense that you are alone, no matter what the challenge might be that you're facing, that, you know, you're facing it alone, you're not, but it can be a very lonely place at times. It's a really important message you share.
It is.
Fantastic. Colin, I just want to point listeners to Man vs. Food, The Fallible Man. It's a brilliant read.
Thank you.
There's an awful lot that you can gain from it. I really enjoyed it. I think there's a lot to take away there. And I think it's a great testimony. Where should we be pointing listeners? Where can they go to buy a copy?
They can buy it on Amazon. So it's self-published on Amazon. So if you search Colin Day, Man vs. Food on Amazon, you can also find me on LinkedIn as well, where there's links to the book. So I just look, as I said to you all along, Lee, if one person picks it up, this is not about selling the book. This is not a plug for the book, doing this interview. But if someone picks it up, and reads it and it's made a difference to their lives, then job done as far as I'm concerned.
Brilliant. Colin, it's been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed this conversation. We covered a lot of ground. We've talked about a lot of things, which has been wonderful, really insightful, really appreciate your time. I think you're a great example of someone who, you know, for all intents and purposes, it would be really easy to level this generalization and kind of go, as a guy's doing all right, you know, look at his career, he's flying, he's really, and yet all these challenges, and we said right at the very beginning, addiction does not discriminate. Addiction does, you know, it doesn't matter who you are, where you are, how you're perceived, doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. Actually, that addiction will come after you. If it's gonna bare its teeth, it'll come.
Yep.
As will a multitude of other things. So, you know, really, really important message around resilience and overcoming adversity that I think is a really positive message, and just says to everybody listening, right, there are things you can do. It's never too late, never too desperate. You can get help, you can overcome. So I really appreciate you coming on and sharing it with us. It's been a real pleasure.
No, thank you for having me. I mean, it was fantastic that I was contacted to come and do this. So I talk about stepping outside of your comfort zone. This has definitely been that, but I've really enjoyed it. So thank you.
Brilliant. Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for listening to today's Extrology podcast. I really appreciate your audience and ears. If you've enjoyed it, then why not hop onto iTunes and give us a review? I'd really appreciate anything that you might have to say. Any feedback always gratefully received, and look forward to hosting you next time. See you soon. Just a reminder, today's podcast is brought to you by Progresso Talent Partners. Visit www.progressotalent.com today for more information.